So our next student speaker of the night will be Srihari Gurugubelli. Srihari is a senior here at IMSA who is actively involved in organizations like Talent, ISA, LEAD, and SCC. He believes that his Indian culture is invaluable. However, the startling truth is that diverse cultures are disappearing across today's societies, and he can't stand the thought of a society that doesn't value culture. Realizing the plethora of experiences in his own life that have highlighted both cultural loss and growth, he wanted to share his story and empower others to support diverse communities. With that being said, please give a warm welcome to Srihari Gurugubelli with his talk, Why Cultural Loss is Not Unbeatable. Thank you.
Oh, wow. He speaks Telugu? The number of tones I've heard this statement in is absolutely astonishing. Sometimes with affection, sometimes surprise, and sometimes pride, but always with happiness. In the latest instance, I had just met one of my mom's old friends from college, and he had remarked on my greeting him in Telugu, our mother language from India. Sure, I wasn't born in India, but why did I get this remark so frequently? I mean, Telugu is still my language, right? Yet, I've heard this countless times over the years, whether we're meeting family in India, with relatives in the United States, or even just at social gathering. What was it about knowing Telugu that made me, just a normal kid, so interesting? I witnessed the answer years later when the remarks turned into questions. I now had a younger brother, Chinni, who met all the same family friends and relatives that I had. This time, instead of, oh wow, he speaks Telugu, it was, does he speak Telugu? To which we had to give the same answer just about every time. No, not really. Realization dawned upon me as this happened time and time again, and that was that no one expected our culture to be carried on. Of course, everyone wanted it to, but in reality, American-born kids picking it up was surprising, and loss across the generation was expected. As I eventually came to realize through my family's continuous experiences meeting new people in the US, culture loss is an incredibly prevalent issue. Take, for example, the historically relevant phenomenon of assimilation, where immigrants became Americans. I mean, what does that even mean? Much of the same thing still occurs, and a lot of the problem is due to the fact that these concepts are invisible when it comes to the numbers. I mean, how do I quantify not knowing the religious stories that adults in my life know like the backs of their very hand? How do I measure not knowing the traditional dances that my parents have danced hundreds of times? How do I analyze not knowing the festivals that my parents looked forward to and celebrated so dearly year after year? And the truth is, we're only barely scratching the surface of what culture is. Approaching constructs such as shared values, common ideologies, or even goals within a culture, we come up just about empty-handed. However, one of the few concepts that we can empirically examine ends up being language. According to Scientific American, the key indicator of the decline in cultural diversity is language loss. So we've definitely got something. Although, even within language, there are holes as to what we can examine scientifically. I mean, cataloging the proficiency of every single minority child's native language in the United States is just nowhere near possible, and I think we all know that. However, what we can do is look at what happens to kids' languages as they learn. This leads us to United States schools. So let's examine how education affects languages, and specifically, programs that practice what's known as subtractive bilingualism. Now, as complex as it may seem, subtractive bilingualism is really a simple concept. First, let's start with bilingualism. Fluency in or use of two languages. Simple, right? Next, subtractive. Able or tending to remove. So, subtractive bilingualism is when someone learns a new language, but learning them costs them their proficiency in their first, until they are fully unable to maintain their native language. This is exactly the story of what happened to my brother, the reason why the happy remarks turned into those sad acknowledgements. Both of us grew up with Telugu before English. For preschool, he even attended an academy specifically meant for students who needed additional development in English before kindergarten. However, a study published in the Journal for Educational Psychology found early education exclusively in a societally dominant language can cause subtractive bilingualism. Accordingly, single language education from here on out contributed to my brother's decline in Telugu proficiency. Let's take a look at the data. Working with the data set from the Children of Immigrants longitudinal study, researchers analyzed a group of 5,266 8th and 9th graders across 77 ethnicities, all of whom were second or 1.5 generation immigrants, meaning they were born in the US to immigrant children or had immigrated to the US as young children, respectively. Of these students, the researchers found that over 2/3 were English dominant, and just 16% had proficiency in their native language. If we liberally assume that these 5,000 plus students represent just 20 languages between them, that 16% tells us that we can expect this group to have fluency in 3 languages and loss of native language proficiency in 17. Let that sink in for a moment. 17 languages. 17 languages that are gone, completely gone. Let's increase the scale a bit. According to United States Census data, second-generation immigrants made up approximately 36 million people in 2010. Applying the startling findings from the previous study, that 16% tells us that we can expect 30.24 of these 36 million to not be highly proficient in their native language and unable to pass it on, just like my brother Chinni. On phone calls with our grandparents, Chinni can't do much more than say hi and the most basic of Telugu greetings. This means that there are 30 million others disconnected from their grandparents and extended families. What's more is that when we travel to India, Chinni's unable to communicate on his own. This tells us that there's 30 million, just like my brother, feeling utterly lost in the very same places that their parents grew up just a few years ago. It turns out that subtractive bilingualism actually goes even further than a concept that just happens to affect students. It's actually a systematic part of widely, and get this, acceptably used English language programs in this country. According to a certified member in the field, across the United States, many ESL or ESOL programs practice subtractive bilingualism. Now, given that the National Center for Education Statistics reported approximately 5 million students as English learners in 2020, that's 5 million kids that, as shown by the previous study, are going to be unable to pass on their native languages. Now, typically, this is the part of the talk where we start to turn things around. The part where my tone starts to shift. The inspirational music starts to play in your heads. I tell you about how we can fix these issues, and we get to the happily ever after ending. Well, this is unfortunately not one of those talks, because we cannot concretely fix subtractive bilingualism. The closest thing we do have is its direct alternative, a concept known as additive bilingualism. In a general sense, additive bilingualism refers to when the process of bilingual acquisition and learning is seen as societally, cognitively, and educationally beneficial. In the context of education specifically, it refers to when English language programs aim to consciously maintain their students' native language proficiencies while teaching English. So, students of these programs become fully bilingual, keeping proficiency in their native language. Research conducted over the last 40 years has consistently demonstrated that students of these additive programs are also significantly more likely to succeed educationally, proving their greater value. Now, if only we could take all of our English language programs and switch them to additively structured ones. But how much of the problem would we even fix by making this change? I mean, not every instance of subtractive bilingualism occurs due to ESL or ESOL, and implementing these programs would take extensive resources. Many languages are forced out outside of schools, largely due to societal stigmas. And to that end, much of the problem remains invisible. I mean, we saw how many of the concepts in culture didn't even have clear measurables at the beginning. And now the best solution to our most concrete one, language, isn't even a perfect fix. So, what do we even do? Well, it turns out that fighting abstract issues like culture loss with concrete implementations like additive bilingualism programs isn't always the best approach. So let's step away from the concrete and into the abstract, because cue the inspirational music in your heads, there is something that each and every one of us can do to keep our communities as diverse as they are. It's not to go out and become ESL certified, opening up academies of bilingual education programs. It's not to devote the rest of our lives to studying how to maintain culture. It's simply to embrace diversity and encourage those around us to do the same. Let me show you. Leaving home at 15, I'll admit, I didn't have the strongest connection to my culture. I mean, sure, I ate my cultural food, spoke my native language, and had a general awareness. But that awareness is far, and I mean far, from the appreciation I now have. I mean, my Spotify's more Bollywood than anything. I've picked up bits of Hindi, a language that's not even my own native language. I've learned how to dance Garba at some of my favorite campus events, and even learned how to make dosas, something my mom found pretty funny. Over the last 2.5 years, some of my fondest memories have been made by bonding over my culture in an environment that supports it. And it's safe to say, I value my culture infinitely more than I did 3 years ago. Infinitely more than 3 years ago. Even my social media pages have changed to reflect more culturally relevant content. With social media, the world is at our fingertips every moment of the day, and we can use this to make a real impact. A study on intercultural adaptation found that people tend to use social media to become more integrated into their host cultures. So, since we know that the choices we make of what to support online can impact those adjusting to the United States, why don't we use our voices to promote diversity, counteracting the otherwise completely invisible issue that is culture loss? Furthermore, each and every one of us can help create communities that value diversity everywhere we go. As high schoolers, most of us have seen very, very little of this world. And thankfully, high school has been a place where we've been encouraged to express who we are, not hide it. But there are other places we'll go. Seniors, we're gonna be out of here pretty soon, on to places with, frankly, who knows what community values. Let's make sure we continue to express the love of culture, just like my fondest memories, encouraging others to embrace it, not hide it. And individually, strive to express your own culture, especially language. Whether it's socially, academically, or as small as it may seem, even if it's just at home, because we are losing part of what makes our world as beautiful as it is. Culture loss may seem like an invisible issue on paper, but I hope you see that it is by no means something that we can't fight. We don't need new teachers and new programs. We don't need certifications and courses implemented across the nation. We don't need anything more than ourselves. Thank you.